Early afternoon, the street held the stillness of heavy heat, the kind that seemed to press downward from above while radiating upward from below, making the air feel almost solid. The sun sat high and without mercy, bleaching the edges of shadows and turning each surface into a slow-burning plate. The asphalt shimmered faintly in the distance, waves of light bending just enough to distort the far end of the block. Near the corner of a faded storefront whose paint had surrendered to years of weather and neglect, a thin, brown dog lay tethered to a short length of chain, the metal anchored low to a bent pole that leaned slightly toward the street. The chain allowed almost no freedom, barely the distance of one paw step forward or back before the pull tightened and stopped him, forcing his body into a small, constant confinement. His ribs rose and fell in a slow, shallow rhythm, each breath measured. Not from choice, but from the economy of energy that comes with exhaustion. The fur along his spine was thin, dulled from both age and neglect, and at the neck it gave way to bare skin where the collar had rubbed raw. The wound was not fresh but carried the flat, inflamed look of something aggravated each day by the same unyielding pressure. A dried patch of blood marked the fur near his right forepaw, clumping the strands together into a hardened knot. His eyes, half-lidded and clouded with fatigue, did not follow the movement of the world around him. Even the passing of shadows, people walking by, did not pull his head from where it lay between his paws. His ears moved more than any other part of him, twitching now and then toward the faint, lazy buzz of flies that circled near his shoulders. The street was not empty. A man passed carrying a thin grocery bag, its contents shifting faintly as he walked. His eyes flicked toward the dog, but his steps did not slow. Two schoolchildren, their uniforms creased from the day, walked along the opposite side, speaking in low voices, the words lost in the space between. An older woman shaded her brow with one hand as she crossed the street, her gaze catching for a heartbeat on the figure by the pole before she turned back to her own path. Some looked longer than others, but all kept moving. It was not malice, but the ordinary distance of strangers, the assumption that someone else might be responsible, or that nothing could be done. And so the dog remained where he was, his breathing faintly labored, as though each intake of air carried more weight than it should have to bear. A man walking in the opposite direction slowed without obvious reason, then passed the storefront entirely before stopping. He turned after only 3 steps, drawn not by a sound, there was none, but by the absence of it, by the stillness that seemed to ask without words. He walked back with measured steps, stopping several paces from the dog. His eyes moved first over the chain, then the collar, then the slow movement of the animal's sides. The rise of each breath seemed to take longer than the fall, the air leaving with less effort than it took to gather. The skin beneath the sparse fur was a pale, unhealthy pink at the pressure points, the ribs standing out like the framing beneath thin fabric. Kneeling slowly until his weight rested on the balls of his feet, the stranger let his hands fall loosely to his sides, not reaching, not forcing. "Easy now," he said quietly, his voice no louder than the faint stirring of a torn poster that flapped lazily against the wall nearby. At the sound, one ear rotated toward him, followed a moment later by the other. The dog's eyes flickered open fully for an instant, finding him, then lowered again, the effort costing more than it could afford. The chain itself was no thicker than a finger, dulled to a matte gray with patches of orange where rust had taken root. At its far end, where it met the pole, a frayed length of rope formed a crude knot, its fibers stiff from sun and weather. Each time the dog adjusted his position, the rope fibers strained faintly against the metal, producing a dry, brittle sound almost too soft to notice. His tongue, pale at the edges, slipped out once every half-minute or so to pass briefly over cracked lips before retreating again, leaving no lasting relief. The smell here was layered. The dry, mineral scent of sun-baked dust, the faint tang of warm rust, and something else, an animal scent dulled by heat but not entirely gone. The stranger glanced up and down the street again, scanning for anyone who might approach with the familiarity of ownership. No one did. A door closed somewhere in the middle distance, the flat bang carrying in the still air before dissolving back into the static hum of the afternoon. Somewhere further off, a small motorbike passed, its engine note softening as it turned away into another street. The stranger remained, his presence neither hurried nor passive. He studied the way the dog occasionally shifted his hind legs, stretching them a few inches forward only to draw them back again into the same position. It was not a movement toward comfort so much as a reflex against cramp, a motion of necessity rather than choice. The heat pressed in on both of them, thick and without movement, the kind that drained thought into the simplest questions. How much longer? How much more? The stranger considered the facts with plain clarity. Prolonged heat would drain what little energy remained. Without water, his body could not keep the rhythm of breath much longer. Every passing minute meant the line between exhaustion and collapse grew thinner. The risk was not distant. It was here, measured in breaths. If nothing changed, the stillness would outlast the rise and fall of his ribs. Kneeling there, the man kept his body language loose and his breathing steady, letting the dog measure him in his own time. Trust, if it came, would come from quiet persistence, not demand. A shadow shifted across the ground as a small cloud moved briefly across the sun, the light softening for only a moment before returning in full strength. He knew this reprieve would not last, that the small shade was more reminder than relief. The dog's gaze lifted once more, lingering longer this time, the pupils narrowing faintly in the brightness. For the first time since the man had stopped, the dog's tail moved, not wagging but curling slightly toward his hind leg as if adjusting balance. It was enough, the smallest marker of life choosing still to respond. And so the stranger stayed where he was, balanced between patience and the growing urgency that pressed harder with each second. In the silence, the moment to act was drawing closer, as steady and certain as the heat that filled the space around them. The dog's breathing moved in a slow, deliberate pattern, as if each rise and fall of his rib cage had to be measured against what little energy he still possessed. From the stranger's position, crouched just a few feet away, the toll of neglect was plain. The collar sat too tightly around the base of the neck, the skin beneath rubbed raw until the hair was gone, leaving an angry ring of exposed flesh. The clasp, dulled from age, pressed into that wound with every shift, and small flies lingered there, drawn by the moisture and heat, scattering only when an ear flicked weakly in irritation. His lips were pale, dry, and split, edges flaking where the skin had cracked. The slow pass of his tongue across them left no visible relief, only a faint glisten that faded almost instantly in the hot air. There was a faint metallic scent, not sharp enough to be fresh blood, but that unmistakable trace that comes when a wound has been left to dry in the open. His body carried no outward tremor of panic, only the quieter signs of deep fatigue, the pause before each breath, the heaviness in his posture, and the slight slack in his muscles that comes when movement has lost its point. He tested the chain once, front legs pressing forward until the thin metal drew taut and then stopped without resistance, settling back with the kind of surrender that spoke less of obedience and more of depleted reserves. The small gesture had cost him, his sides lifting in a deeper breath afterward, but even that slight effort seemed to drain him further, the exhale sinking his frame back to the warm concrete. The afternoon air hung unmoving over the narrow street, the kind of heat that swallowed sound, muting the small life of the town until only the faintest cues remained, the far-off drone of a motorbike passing somewhere beyond view, the faint scuff of sandals over dust-soft pavement, and the quiet buzz of flies orbiting their chosen point. The sunlight pooled against the ground in dense, wavering waves, heat lifting in unbroken streams that caught in the back of the throat and sat heavily in the lungs. The stranger could feel it gathering on his skin. Each moment under it was another degree of strain. For the dog, without shelter, the heat was a steady extraction of what little remained in his body. It was no longer a distant hazard, but an immediate one, the kind that did not announce its arrival with drama, only with the slow collapse of what had been holding on. His posture told it plainly. The slow blinks that lingered too long between open and closed, the faint trembling in the right hind leg that never shifted for relief, and the shallow pull of breath that seemed less an act of drawing in air and more a fight not to lose what was already inside. The stranger remained low to the ground, careful not to lean in too close, his movements unhurried so as not to startle. His presence was a quiet one, offering the animal time to take in the scent and shape of him without pressure. The patch of shade from his own frame lay narrow and incomplete, spilling partly over the dog's flank but doing little to alter the oppressive warmth of the day. In the small space allowed by the chain, no more than the length needed for 2 short steps in either direction, the ground showed no signs of recent pacing. There were no disturbed paw prints, no half-dug attempts to find cooler earth. Only the matted patch of flattened fur and dust where the animal had been lying for hours, perhaps longer. The chain itself, thinner than the width of a finger, bore the dull gleam of metal that had been left exposed to weather for seasons, its links worn smooth where they met, catching light for a moment before falling back into shadow. At its end, the rope binding it to the rusted pole was pulled tight, the fibers dry and splayed at the edges, fraying from time and friction. It was the kind of tie that had been in place too long, where the act of unfastening it might prove more difficult than breaking it entirely. The dog, for his part, made no attempt to chew at it, no motion toward escape. Even the awareness of confinement seemed less immediate than the effort it would take to challenge it. The stranger's voice came then, soft, almost swallowed by the heat-heavy air. "It's all right," he said, the tone steady, without command, carrying no edge that might force a response. The dog's ears twitched, that small reflex to sound still intact, though the movement seemed to cost him almost nothing. His head lifted a fraction, enough to alter the pull of the collar against his neck and loosen the skin there for a breath or two, but then gravity reclaimed it, lowering it back to the ground with the same unhurried inevitability as a leaf settling from a branch. In that small motion, there was a truth the stranger could not ignore. The dog was still aware, still responsive, but the gap between sensing and acting was growing wider with each passing minute. The sun bore down without pause, its heat working in the quiet, patient way of things that do not need speed to be dangerous. Here, time was not measured by the hands of a clock but by the body's capacity to keep working against the elements. Without water, without shade, the balance could tip quickly from exhaustion to collapse, and from there to something that could not be reversed. The animal's movements were not those of one choosing stillness for comfort, but of one whose body had already begun to conserve what little it had left, even if that conservation meant surrendering the option to move altogether. Each decision, whether to blink, to shift a paw, or to lift his head, carried a cost, and the arithmetic of survival in such heat meant that most of those decisions ended in inaction. Even stillness demanded something from him, the kind of low, constant drain that gave nothing back. The risks were visible now, no longer subtle hints in posture, but fixed realities of the moment. The stranger could see them in the looseness of the muscles across the dog's back, in the shallow flex of his ribs, and in the way his eyes no longer sought movement in their surroundings. The point for quiet observation had passed. The margin to act was narrowing into something that could be measured in breaths. Without change, the scene would not hold in this fragile balance for much longer. The stranger knew that the stillness he was witnessing was not the kind that meant rest, but the kind that could easily harden into permanence if left untouched. In the heavy quiet of that narrow street, with the heat folding down from above and pressing upward from below, the truth was simple. If nothing intervened soon, this animal would not see the relief of evening. The stranger lowered himself into a steady kneel, careful to keep his movements unhurried, letting the air between them hold its quiet weight. The dog's gaze did not shift at first, the lids still half drawn in that slow, weary rhythm of an animal running low on reserves. The heat lay heavy on the narrow strip of ground, the sun working against them both. Each moment another small subtraction from the dog's strength. From this distance, the faint rise of dust with each breath was visible, curling upward before the still air swallowed it. The stranger extended a hand, not to touch, but to let the air carry forward his scent, allowing the animal the first decision in this fragile exchange. A shallow bowl of water rested at his side, the surface trembling faintly with the movement of his arm as he slid it forward, one measured inch at a time. The light caught the water's surface, casting a shifting reflection onto the parched earth, a small glimmer against the muted tones of the day. The dog's eyes tracked it slowly, not with urgency but with the tentative awareness of one too tired to act quickly. His nostrils flared once, pulling in the faint scent of moisture, and for a moment nothing else in his posture changed. Then, with the slow inevitability of necessity overcoming hesitation, his head lifted from the ground. The motion revealed the collar's full mark on his neck, raw, inflamed skin where fur had long since thinned away. The rope shifted against the pole, its fibers creaking faintly as the dog leaned forward, the chain drawing tight until the restraint met its limit. The bowl sat just beyond reach, the gap no more than the width of a hand, yet for the dog it might as well have been the far side of the street. The stranger saw the pause that followed, the stillness born not of distrust but of calculation, as if the animal's body was weighing the cost of one more attempt against what little was left. The man's voice came low and steady, carrying no push or pull, only presence. "It's all right," he murmured, the words serving more as a marker of calm than as an instruction. The dog's ears shifted faintly toward the sound, a muscle twitched beneath the fur, and his weight shifted forward again. The chain's resistance returned instantly, a sharp reminder of the boundary neither could yet cross. His tongue flicked across his dry lips once, twice, as if testing the thought of what waited just ahead. The stranger eased the bowl forward another inch, the metal faintly scraping the dirt until it settled within the narrow range allowed by the rope. There was no sudden rush toward it, only the slow, deliberate lowering of the dog's head until the tip of his nose touched the rim. His first lap was small, barely drawing more than a trace of water, but it broke the stillness that had held him for so long. The sound of it was quiet, the steady rhythm of an animal reintroducing its body to what it had been missing. Each swallow was shallow and measured, his eyes half closed as if conserving even the small energy of focus. The stranger stayed motionless, knowing that any sudden movement could tip this fragile moment back into retreat. With each sip, the muscles along the dog's neck moved against the collar, the raw skin shifting with the strain, and the rope above him swayed slightly in rhythm with his motion. Here, the stakes were as clear as the heat pressing down on them. Without water, the body's balance would tip quickly toward collapse, and even now, hydration would come slowly, needing time his condition might not allow. Still, this was movement, however small, and in the unbroken wait of the afternoon, it was enough to begin. The dog drew back after a few moments, the tip of his nose damp, his breathing steadier but still shallow. The rope lay taut once more between them, its frayed edge holding the line that defined how far relief could reach. ChatGPT said. The stranger shifted his weight onto one knee, the dry grit pressing through the fabric of his trousers as he leaned toward the point where the rope met steel. The knot was buried deep in layers of frayed fiber, hardened by time and tension into something closer to stone than cord. It had bitten into itself, each strand swollen and stiff, shaped by months of strain. He studied it for a moment, letting his breathing settle into an even rhythm. The air was still thick with heat, heavy enough that each inhalation felt slow to complete, and the sweat that traced along his jaw carried a faint sting as it slid into the creases of his skin. Every motion now had to be deliberate. A sudden pull or sharp noise could send the dog recoiling, wasting precious energy he no longer had to spare. The man's fingers moved slowly, testing the rope's surface, finding the points where it gave fractionally under pressure. The dog's eyes followed him with quiet intensity, ears angled forward, his body frozen in a state between readiness and exhaustion. The tremor along his flank was faint but constant, the kind that spoke of muscles kept tense for far too long. The rope shifted slightly as the stranger worked, and the dog's head lifted, nostrils flaring once before he stilled again, watching the man's hands instead of the water bowl now resting at his side. A few coarse fibers broke loose under the twisting motion, releasing the faint musty scent of weathered rope. The knot, however, held firm, each turn locked beneath another. The man adjusted his grip, using his thumbs to work into the tighter loops, feeling for the spot where the rope's memory might break. His voice, low and steady, came again, no louder than a breath. Almost there. It was less reassurance than a signal, a sound that carried no suddenness, nothing to startle. The dog's tail lay flat, unmoving, but his weight shifted a fraction toward the pole. Sweat gathered along the man's brow, dropping to the dust beneath them, darkening small patches that dried within seconds. The heat was unrelenting, and every minute spent here added to the risk that the animal's reserves would drain past the point of recovery. The knot began to loosen in slow increments, a quarter turn at a time, the strain in the rope easing with each small victory. The fibers rasped against his skin, leaving faint red marks along his knuckles. At last, one loop came free enough to slip his fingers beneath, and he held there for a moment, keeping his hands steady so the movement would register to the dog as nothing threatening. The animal's gaze softened fractionally, the tension in his shoulders less defined, though his breathing remained shallow. The stranger's focus stayed on the task, knowing that any sudden failure in the rope could jolt the dog into flight, undoing the fragile calm between them. Another twist, a careful pull, and the knot surrendered its first real slack, the rope hanging with a fraction less rigidity. It was not freedom yet, but it was the first breach in the thing that had held the dog fast for so long. The rope gave way with the faintest sigh, the final fibers releasing their hold after hours, maybe years, of strain. It slipped loose in the man's hands, its tension draining away until it lay soft and weightless against the ground. He did not pull, did not urge, and only held the slack gently, as though even the absence of restraint could be startling if introduced too quickly. The air around them was still heavy with heat, the dry earth radiating warmth upward, and the dust stirred faintly at the smallest movements. The dog remained where he was for a moment, the sudden freedom not rushing into his muscles but settling in slowly, like water seeping into dry soil. His chest rose and fell in a shallow rhythm, the breaths still tinged with the fatigue of long restraint. A fly passed near his ear, and he flicked it away with the smallest twitch of his skin. Eyes still locked on the space in front of him, the man kept his body low, his head angled slightly to the side so as not to face the dog directly. In rescue work, pressure could be measured in more ways than physical force. Stillness, here, was the best tool he had. The rope lay in a small curve between them, the only connection now, one that could be abandoned at any instant. Minutes stretched in silence, broken only by the hum of distant insects. The dog's nostrils quivered, catching the faint scent of the shaded patch nearby, a strip of earth where heat gave way to cooler air, marked by the faint rustle of dry leaves overhead. The man noticed the subtle change in the animal's weight, the barely perceptible shift forward, and the way his toes flexed against the ground. Then, with the caution of something that had learned to measure every risk, the dog took one step. His leg trembled faintly with the effort, though it was not pain that slowed him but the foreign nature of movement without resistance. The rope trailed softly against his side, no longer binding, only touching. Another breath, another glance toward the man, and he stepped again, this time angling toward the shade. The space between them widened, the connection loosening further until it was only a line resting lightly across the earth. The man allowed it to fall entirely, the end slipping from his hand without sound. There was no rush in the dog's pace, no dramatic leap into safety, just a quiet, careful entry into a cooler patch where the air moved differently. The change in his body was small but visible, shoulders lowering a fraction, eyes half-lidding against the brightness, and his tail no longer pressed so tightly against his hind legs. The man remained where he was, watching without advancing. The first steps had been made. The rest, if they came, would belong to the animal alone. In the world of rescue, this was the delicate edge, where intervention met independence, and where the cost of one wrong move could undo hours of trust. The shade swallowed the dog's outline slightly, softening the light on his coat. A breeze lifted the edges of the dry grass, carrying with it the scent of cooler earth and something far beyond this small, enclosed space. The man knew the risks were not over. Heat still pressed in on all sides, dehydration remained a threat. And any sudden fear could send the dog bolting into harsher ground. But for now, in this small, measured moment, one truth stood firm. The rope was gone, and the choice was his. The dog stood still beneath the sparse cover, ears tuned to distant sounds, chest rising and falling in a quieter rhythm. Somewhere far off, unseen leaves moved in the wind, and the air felt just slightly lighter than before. ChatGPT said the man's steps were unhurried, his hand holding the rope with the looseness of someone guiding rather than pulling. The dog trailed beside him, each movement measured, as though weighing the risk of every step. Their progress down the quiet street was slow, interrupted by small pauses when the dog's head lifted to scan for shapes or sounds that might threaten him. A car door shut somewhere far off and his ears twitched, body tensing for a moment before he decided to keep moving. The rope hung in a soft curve between them, swaying slightly with the rhythm of their steps. The air was warm, the afternoon light flat and gentle, carrying the scent of sun-baked pavement mixed with the faint trace of grass ahead. The stranger's voice came once, low and steady. "You're okay." But mostly there was silence, only the sound of claws clicking lightly on concrete and the quiet shift of fabric when the man adjusted his grip. Ahead, the park's edge came into view, a patch of muted green bordered by the pale stone of a low wall. The dog slowed again, his nose working in short bursts, catching scents carried on the faint wind. Something in the air, water, fresh earth, pulled his attention forward. His tail hung still but no longer tucked tightly, his body leaning slightly in the direction of the smell. The man shifted his path toward the source, a small fountain set in the park's center. Its shallow basin glimmered with the movement of water, the sound of its gentle splash breaking the stillness of the space. The dog stopped at the edge, muscles taut as he glanced from the water to the man, searching for any sign of restriction. The rope was held loose. No resistance came. Cautiously he stepped forward, lowering his head to sniff the surface. A moment later, his muzzle broke the water, tongue sweeping in quick, desperate laps. The water rippled with each movement, tiny arcs of it spilling over his chin to scatter on the warm concrete. His eyes half closed, not in contentment but in focus. The way animals do when meeting an essential need after too long. Each swallow seemed to draw a layer of tension from his body, his stance shifting from guarded to grounded, paws planted with more confidence. Still, his ears remained alert, flicking at small noises from beyond the park's perimeter. The man stayed just behind him, neither rushing nor stepping away, his presence steady but unobtrusive. When the dog paused, water dripping from the fur around his mouth, the air between them held a kind of fragile stillness. The fountain's soft, repeating splash filled it, carrying the quiet suggestion of safety without promising permanence. This was a pause in the strain, not the end of it. His breathing slowed, the rise and fall of his ribs no longer urgent. Yet the rope between them still mattered, still marked the difference between release and uncertainty. The stranger knew that in moments like these, the risk had not passed. A frightened animal could retreat again, slipping back into the patterns that had kept him alive until now, but might not keep him alive much longer. The man adjusted his footing, making sure his shadow didn't fall over the dog. The afternoon sun shifted slightly behind drifting clouds, cooling the stones underfoot. The scent of water lingered in the air, mixing with the faint metallic note from the fountain's worn edges. The dog lapped again, slower this time, pausing between each mouthful to lift his head and scan. When a distant bark echoed from somewhere deeper in the neighborhood, his body went rigid for a beat, then eased when no further sound followed. The stranger's fingers shifted lightly on the rope, not to pull but to remind the animal of his nearness. As the drinking slowed to a stop, droplets clung to the fur along the dog's jaw, catching the softened light. His stance remained angled toward the fountain, but his breathing told of a body slowly replenishing what had been stretched thin for too long. This moment, unremarkable to most, was a fragile step forward, the meeting of necessity and trust, the kind of trust that was built not in grand gestures but in the quiet act of letting an animal choose when to move, when to pause, and when to drink. The risk was still there, in every twitch of an ear, every glance toward the open edges of the park, but for now, the only thing between them was a length of rope that hung loosely, holding nothing but space. ChatGPT said, "In the early light of morning, the air held a coolness that would fade before noon, the kind that seemed to soften the edges of the city's hard surfaces." The fountain in the park murmured quietly in the distance, its sound folding into the rustle of leaves overhead. The stranger walked with the same unhurried pace as before, hands steady, gaze lowered enough to show no threat. Near the curve of the low stone wall, the dog lay in the dappled shade. His ribs rose and fell in the slow rhythm of rest, though one ear twitched at the sound of approaching footsteps. There was no rope around his neck today. No tether anchored him to the place where they had met. Only the weight of caution kept him still at first. The stranger paused a few steps away, lowering himself slightly to the dog's eye level without bending too close, giving him the distance to choose. The dog shifted, his paws scraping softly against the ground as he lifted himself from his resting place. His body was lean but less tense than the day before, his tail low, swaying faintly, not in excitement, but in a tentative measure of safety. The man waited, letting the dog's own movement set the pace. The fountain's basin glimmered faintly behind them, the same place where thirst had been eased hours earlier. The scent of water still lingered there, mingled with the earthiness of damp stone. The dog's gaze flicked between the stranger's face and the open park gate beyond, as if weighing paths. For a long breath, neither moved forward. The risk was unchanged. The dog was still unclaimed, still exposed to hunger, injury, or the wrong kind of human approach, but something in the space between them had shifted. Slowly, the dog padded forward. His steps were deliberate, his head lowering slightly as he closed the gap. The man did not reach out. Instead, he kept one hand loosely at his side, his shoulders turned just enough to show ease, not expectation. When the dog came close enough, he paused again, the faint scent of worn fabric and skin replacing the smell of grass. His nose brushed lightly against the man's knee. Then, almost imperceptibly, he let the weight of his head rest there. It was not long, just a brief, steady contact, but it was enough. The man's hand moved then, slow and measured, fingers brushing over the coarse fur at the side of the dog's neck. "It's okay, boy," he said softly, the words more rhythm than meaning. The dog didn't pull away. The park gate stood open, framing the street beyond. The stranger began to walk toward it, his stride even, with no leash to guide or restrain. The dog followed without hesitation this time, his paws silent against the path. He stayed close but not pressed in. his movements keeping to the man's pace as though drawn by a quiet understanding. The space around them felt changed, not secured yet, not free from the possibility of loss, but balanced for the moment, held by mutual choice. As they neared the edge of the park, sunlight spilled through the trees, catching in the fine dust rising with each step. The man glanced down once, a brief acknowledgement, and the dog lifted his head in return, eyes catching the light before looking forward again. At the threshold of the gate, the dog hesitated, his weight settling slightly back on his haunches as though testing the moment. Then, with a small exhale, he crossed into the street's brightness beside the man. The risk remained. Roads ahead, unknown destinations. But something fundamental had altered in the morning quiet. In the faint warmth of that first trust, they moved together, the day opening before them like an untraveled path. By late afternoon, the rain had thinned into nothing more than a faint mist, the kind that lingered in the air without falling. The road ahead glistened in places where shallow puddles held on to the last fragments of the storm, reflecting the muted light. Damp earth released a deep, loamy scent, and every step pressed the softened gravel with a quiet crunch. The man walked with an unhurried pace, his boots leaving a trail that was quickly darkened by moisture. Beside him, the dog matched his stride almost perfectly, his paws pressing into the wet surface, each print filling with a thin sheen of water. The animal's coat was still damp in places, darkened along the spine, yet the fine hairs near his face had begun to lift in the gentle breeze. They moved together without a word, their steps in sync, separated only by a narrow strip of space. The dog's body stayed angled slightly toward the man, his head low, ears shifting occasionally to catch faint sounds from the distance. A bird settling into the tree line, the drip of rainwater falling from the higher branches. Every so often, his flank brushed against the fabric of the man's trousers, a brief, unspoken point of contact that neither broke nor hurried. The man did not reach for him, nor did he call, yet his presence held a quiet gravity, a slow and steady assurance that seemed to guide their direction as much as the road itself. The damp air carried the smell of leaves that had been soaked through and of moss awakened by rain. Sunlight broke through in uneven shafts, painting the road with pale gold where it slipped past the ragged edges of clouds. These moments of brightness were fleeting, moving with them, touching the dog's face and the man's shoulder before drifting on. Long shadows stretched ahead, their shapes merging and separating as they walked. The dog's tail hung in a low, loose curve, swaying faintly with each step, not lifted, not tucked, simply balanced, a neutral weight behind him. His breathing was steady, and though his gaze shifted now and then to the edge of the trees, it returned always to the path in front of them. Each sound they passed became part of the rhythm, the soft splash of a paw in a puddle, the wet patter of water dripping from an overhanging branch, and the muted sigh of wind moving through grass at the roadside. A single crow called from somewhere near the forest, its voice carried long on the damp air before fading. The dog's ears flicked toward the sound, his head lifting briefly, but his stride did not change. He no longer hesitated when the man shifted his weight to change pace, no longer paused to watch for cues from a distance. Their steps moved as one, and the space between them felt deliberate, as if it had been measured by trust rather than by caution. There was no urgency in their journey. Yet the direction was clear. The tree line ahead formed a dark green boundary, softened at the edges where afternoon light clung to the upper leaves. Each step brought them closer, and with it, the road began to narrow, its edges softened by grass and roots that had crept in over seasons. The man's eyes followed the way forward, though now and then he glanced down, not with the searching concern of yesterday, but with the quiet acknowledgement of companionship. When the dog happened to lift his head at the same moment, their eyes met only briefly before both looked ahead again. The world behind them was silent, save for the settling sounds of the passing storm. They did not look back. The man's hands hung loosely at his sides, one brushing lightly against the dog's shoulder when their paths drew closer. It was not a signal, not a command, only a passing reassurance. The dog leaned just for an instant, his head turning so that the side of his face pressed gently against the man's knee before falling back into step. Neither broke rhythm. The road's damp surface began to dry in narrow strips where the sun touched it directly. Here and there, a thin wisp of steam rose from the warmer patches, curling upward before vanishing. The dog's paws left faint smudges on these dry stretches, a softer mark than the defined impressions in the wet earth. Shadows continued to lengthen, drawing their silhouettes forward until they seemed almost to reach the edge of the trees. The forest stood still, holding the low hum of insects and the faint rustle of leaves shifting high above. As they reached the first stretch of shade beneath the taller branches, the air cooled. The dog slowed just enough to match the man's pace precisely, their steps quieter now on the softened ground. The afternoon light was beginning to thin, growing warmer, folding the edges of the day toward evening. Ahead, the path bent, disappearing into the shelter of the trees, and without hesitation, they followed it together, side by side, close enough for their movements to read as one. The last trace of rainwater dripped from the canopy onto the back of the man's coat, darkening the fabric in a small circle. He did not brush it away. The dog's ears shifted at the sound, but his gaze stayed forward. Behind them, the road lay empty, its shallow puddles slowly stilling in the soft gold light. Ahead, the forest welcomed them in silence, and the two shapes, man and dog, moved into its quiet without breaking stride. Pick prompt, a damp, rural road after a morning rain, glistening with puddles, stretching toward a tree line in the distance. A lone man walks slowly along the edge, his clothes slightly wet, his posture calm and steady. At his side, a medium-sized dog with a damp coat walks close, head low, paws darkened with mud. The afternoon sun casts long golden shadows across the wet asphalt, the air still heavy with the scent of rain. Neither looks back, their figures growing smaller toward the horizon, surrounded by quiet countryside.